On Piety by Jean Guibert. Preface. The author is well aware of the perils of writing on piety, such as the discredit attaching to works of the kind. He undertakes it nevertheless, being persuaded that he is doing a useful and perhaps necessary work. His aim is to encourage esteem for piety, not only among those who are given to pious practices, but also among those who treat it with disdain, as something paltry, or speak evil of it as if the practice of it were degrading. It is with this end in view that he makes a study of its nature, explains its effects, and lays down rules for the use of it. There is nothing nobler than piety, since it awakens and applies the activity of the soul to the highest, purest, and most fruitful of lives, the very life of God. Nothing is more advantageous than piety, since by the close contact which it establishes with God, and by the constant effort which it obliges a man to make with regard to himself, it purifies the feelings, enlightens the mind, strengthens the will, gladdens the heart, and stirs up an apostolic fire in the soul. But piety only preserves its worth and yields all its fruits when it is led by the Spirit of wisdom. It would cease to be itself, it would disfigure the soul and become repellent if it degenerated into a superstitious and sterile formalism. Piety has to repel the attacks of which it is the object by uplifting character and by enriching with a wealth of virtues those who live by it. Whenever, as should be the case, pious people show most common sense, most dignity of demeanor, most sympathy, most disinterestedness, and most self-sacrifice, piety and religion itself will need no more apologists. The lives of those who pray will be its most unanswerable defense. If those who are pious will try to enter into the spirit of this little book, the author hopes both that their religious life will be full of sweet consolation to themselves, and that their example will win over to piety a number of those who, though fundamentally religious, do not dare to risk an undertaking which they fear may involve them in bitter disappointment. May this book give many souls a taste for God. From this they will find spontaneously arise a taste for the good. Part 1. The nature of piety. Chapter 1. How piety is misunderstood. Godliness, piety, is profitable to all things, having promise of the life that now is, and of that which is to come. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. This praise of piety by St. Paul must seem strange to worldly folk, for the world does not esteem piety, and has nothing but disdain for those who practice it. The world looks upon piety as useless, good for those who have nothing else to do, and likely to foster delusions in the head of those who are touched with mysticism, but as having no bearing upon real life, and as being rather lowering to the faculties of those who are given to it. If man's most sacred duty is to develop his life, he must have nothing to do with piety, which tends to enfeeble it. What right has the world to pass such a severe judgment upon piety? It declares that the grounds for such a judgment are supplied by the pious themselves. It has examined the connection between their piety and their life, and it claims that their life gains nothing from their piety. So far as their piety is concerned, their life is neither purer, nor more fruitful, nor more devoted, nor less worldly, nor less selfish, nor less full of pride. Such a sweeping sentence is assuredly unjust. For amongst the pious there are a number of choice souls who are truly holy, humble, sympathetic, generous, ready for every sacrifice, diligent in the hardest of tasks, boldly making their way in life, and who are second to none in moral energy, in nobility of heart, and even in practical success. And to anyone who follows them closely, it is plain that it is their piety that sustains and makes them great, and that they draw from communion with God the strength to subdue their lower passions and owe to prayer their lofty aspirations. And were not the saints, who are the greatest of men, all moulded by piety? But it must be admitted that by the side of these characters, who get their greatness from their piety, there are commonplace and vulgar souls who are taken up with the externals and practices of piety, and who nevertheless have been made no better by it. They wear a mask of piety, but know nothing of its living reality. They flatter themselves that they please God with their long prayers and their numerous medals and scapulars, and by joining all kinds of confraternities and third orders, and they forget that God takes no pleasure in these external things unless they help to purify the heart, to subdue the passions, to make one fulfill the duties of one's state of life, and grow in moral perfection and social influence. This perverted, though sincere piety, which is confined to formalities and does not carry with it any moral obligation, which submits to external discipline without changing anything within, is more harmful to the fair fame of devotion than hypocrisy itself. For hypocrisy, which is urged by its ambition to clothe itself in an appearance of religion, is unmasked and confounded sooner or later. False piety, on the contrary, because of its sincerity and perseverance, offers the continued spectacle of a superficial, barren, and impotent religion, which fritters away the soul by mechanical routine and lifeless exercises. Thus it is that, in spite of their good intentions, some of the devout, through their misinterpretation of a life of devotion, convince the world that piety, far from having the promise of the life that now is, depreciates men and sterilizes them in every way, and makes them incapable of fulfilling their destiny. Is there any reason to be astonished that most men, urged on by the need of making a living, and panting with a desire to conquer in the struggle for existence, neglect the practices of religion, in which they fail to find a weapon that makes them stronger, but only a burden which crushes out their breath and clogs their feet? Their contempt is their excuse for standing aloof. If it is not always a fault, it is at any rate a misfortune for men to be ignorant of the nature and value of piety, for it is a source of life that is closed to them. All ought to know it better, both those who make use of its exercises and those who shun even the very appearance of it. Those who have already adopted its practices will gain by going to the root of the matter. How many of them get perhaps no advantage from it, if they were only to learn that it is an interior life, that the external practices are nothing but the shell, that its object is to change the heart, that it is vain and utterly servile if it does not make us better. Would they not esteem it more highly, and follow its rules more gladly, and find it a help towards growth in goodness? At the same time, they would be in the eyes of the world the vindicators and apostles of piety. As long as the world sees no difference between those who pray and those who do not pray at all, it cannot help being skeptical about the real bearing of piety. If it perceives some souls cramped and lessened by a pretence of piety, or others sheltering weaknesses which they dare not acknowledge under the cloak of religion, it is easy to understand that they are tempted to speak against it. But whenever piety manifests itself to men as being an evident cause of the noblest feelings, of self-sacrifice generously accepted, of work courageously undertaken, of suffering patiently endured, of devotion that is entirely disinterested, they will then understand the full value of introducing real piety into one's life, and how important it is to rely upon religion in order to attain moral elevation. How great then is the responsibility incurred by the devout, when by carelessness they bring piety down to the level of worthless formalism, and cause it to be despised by those unacquainted with it, who, when they look for it in them, find only a miserable caricature of it. On the other hand, what a grand apostolate their life would afford, if they offered the world the encouraging spectacle of a piety that was practical, a piety that lit up human life with sanctity and the power of God. Through the evidence of the practical effects of true piety, the world would recognize the potency of its moral action, and thenceforward would begin to hold it in esteem. From esteem to the desire for its possession, the distance is but short, and if we consider the need of moral progress on the one hand, which is experienced by most men, and the fragility on the other hand that they could feel in their will, we may conclude that honest hearts would take refuge in the practices of religion as in a shelter prepared for their weakness, and that they would arm themselves with piety as a store of divine strength, fitted to supply what was lacking in their infirmity. If they were persuaded by the example of pious people, and by the luminous arguments of religious books, that piety is a power, and that it is a regenerative leaven for the fallen, and a store of holy energy for those who wish ever to go forward, there is no doubt that they would be attracted by its benefits, and that they would desire to taste of its sweetness and to experience its power. And therefore, in order at the same time to deepen the life of those who pray, and to attract to the life of piety those who have not begun to pray, we shall now attempt to set forth the nature and effects of true piety. Chapter 2. Piety is an impulse of devoted love. The word piety calls up the thought of love and devotion, and it gives an idea of an affection going to the point of self-surrender. We say of a child that he has filial piety when he shows tender, refined, and generous feelings towards his parents, when his love fills their hearts with joy, and when he sacrifices something that touches himself or his belongings in order to defend or assist them. When we call upon Christ, it is to his loving devotion, pietas, that we appeal. We say to him, O loving Jesus, O Jesu pie, pie Jesu Domine. Do we not then invoke the affection and loving kindness of him who loved us and gave himself for us? There is also such a thing as maternal devotion, consisting of love and self-sacrifice, and it is to this feeling that we appeal when we say to the Blessed Virgin, O Mother, who hast so much loved us, and who hast endured so much for us. From these ideas, it is easy for us to deduce what are the characteristics of Christian piety. It is a religious inclination, certainly, but an inclination accentuated by a love that is full of devotion. It comprises the whole of religion, but it adds to it the fervour of love. Piety is first of all a religious impulse. It therefore assumes that man is in the presence of God, his Creator. It makes man confess that he is the work of God. It leads him to the feet of God, to adore Him prostrate in the dust, and to thank Him for all His benefits. It makes him raise supplicating hands to heaven, to implore the Sovereign Master to console him in his wretchedness and poverty. Thus, on this ground alone, piety enables a man to perform the highest act of which he is capable, for it takes him by that which touches him most intimately and most deeply, and leads him on to that which is greatest, even to God Himself. Thus, a union is effected between that which is best within and that which is best outside of man. And in the presence of this sublime encounter, the most powerful minds are overwhelmed with admiration, for it is a stirring and awful mystery that can only be experienced by those who are entirely sincere and full of humility and reverence. In these relationships of a religious nature, adoration is the prevailing factor. Close intimacy is not set up. They are full of awe and not of love. And apart from Christianity, religion stops there. The pagan never loved his divinities. He feared his gods. He offered them bloody sacrifices because he was afraid, and because he wished to appease them by immolating what was dearest to him. God did not seem to him good and kind, but severe, exacting, and capricious. And the worship of God was intended to ward off the divine vengeance. The Mohammedan apprehends God as being in inaccessible majesty. He prostrates himself before Him because He is great. He obeys Him because he knows that His vengeance is inexorable, but he does not make his supplication to the Father's heart, because he believes the world is enchained in the irrevocable fatalism of His eternal designs. The Jew, too, lived under the law of fear. The password for all who would enter the temple was, "Tremble at my sanctuary." Leviticus chapter 26, verse 2. In the inspiration of their sacred hymns, the prophets sometimes had illuminating lights as to the love and the mercy of God, and then they celebrated His loving kindness. But reverence is what predominates in the ancient worship. Although God was infinitely nearer to the chosen people than to any other nation, He had not become so intimate with them as to make them love Him. The Christian alone it is who loves God, because he alone has seen Him with his eyes and touched Him with his hands in the mystery of the Incarnation, and holds Him in his keeping in the ineffable mystery of the Eucharist. Adoration is always his first act of worship, but love is its end and crown. And this is what transforms the religion of the Christian into piety. Love for God arises in a Christian's heart from the fact that he knows God less as a master than as a father. In the work of creation, and above all in the work of redemption, he sees God principally under His paternal aspect. Without in any way derogating from the majesty of the Creator, His loving kindness is progressively manifested towards us. God has made us because He loved us from all eternity. He fashioned our hearts one by one. He watches over us, and by His providence supplies our needs. He encircles us with His beneficent presence, and His grace permeates our wills, just as the life-giving air fills our lungs. He is all good, this author of our being. How can we help loving Him? Still more evident are the signs of this loving kindness in our Redeemer. He stretches out His hand to His fallen creatures to set them up again. But He does not stoop down from on high like a master. He offers His hand to us on our own footing, like an equal and friend. For by faith we recognize our God under the veil of humanity, hiding the light that would daze us to show the tenderness that touches and draws the heart to Himself. This feeling of loving kindness, this intimacy of a God who is like ourselves, transforms our religious impulse. We go to God not urged by fear, but won by love. We are less at His feet than in His arms, and hence it is piety that springs up in our hearts. But the impulse of love is generous by nature. We refuse nothing to those we love. We offer everything and surrender ourselves. Where fear reigns, what is given is a sacrifice. Where love reigns, what is given is a spontaneous offering made without reserve. When it is love that brings us to God, we come to Him with all that we have and are, our possessions, our powers, our time, our life, our mind and our heart. We put all in His hands, and as He makes us feel that His hands are only open to receive souls that are worthy of Him and who spend themselves in His service, our love lays upon us the high obligation of working at our own improvement, and on expending in an apostolic manner the gifts that we possess for service. This devotion to the God whom we love, this eagerness to forward our own perfection and to spread the life of God round about us in order to please God and to win souls for Him, this it is that gives our religion its fruitfulness, and makes our piety blossom forth, and carries it on through the fruit that it bears to its fulfillment. Such is Christian piety. It imprints upon the religious impulse of our souls the twofold seal of love and generosity that characterize it. In the heart in which it has its birth, it is a feeling of filial affection towards God and an earnest desire for union with Him. It carries us along the path that leads to God, full of cheerfulness and zeal, in the direction of the object of our love. It does not expect that meeting with God will bring it the slumber of an idle repose, but a fresh activity for more fruitful work. Piety, then, is a form of religion, but it is also its highest, most intimate and active form. To religious adoration it joins love. To sacrifice it adds the surrender of self and the ardor of zeal. Religion suffices for salvation assuredly, because it gives the grace that is needed for the goodness that is indispensable. Piety is the best of divine treasures. It is the portion of souls touched by the shaft of the love of God, and it uplifts souls to the higher regions of moral life. But we must take care not to mistake some of the externals of piety for piety itself. The exercises of it are only, as it were, its outer bark, a necessary covering, no doubt, but only required to keep in the sap which circulates within the pith. However unbroken the integument may be, there is no real piety if real intense love is absent from the heart, and if faithful and active service is wanting in the hands. Chapter 3. Piety is a form of life. This primary conception of piety enables us to affirm that it is a kind of life. Although life is a mystery that we cannot fathom, and although it is easier to feel what it is than to explore its nature, at any rate we know that in a living being it is an interior activity. Consider the plant that grows and blossoms in the fields. Note the animal that runs hither and thither, and the way in which it manifests its emotions. You say that they are alive. How do you distinguish them from stones without life? You observe that they live by the interior activity that animates them. If they were only moved from outside, like a ball in a game of tennis, you would treat them as inert bodies, because they would only have a borrowed motion. But because an inner force, which is real though imperceptible to the eye, produces from within the phenomena that strike your observation, you attribute life to this hidden power. This activity in the living creature is subject to innumerable vicissitudes. It may increase in intensity, and its progress is brought out clearly by the manifestation of its happy effects. It may diminish so as to vanish altogether, and its manifestations then become less and less marked, until they disappear in death. To maintain itself and to grow, it must be nourished by borrowing from outside, and since it wastes by its own action, it would perish if it were not renewed by the assimilation of external elements. But we say that piety is a kind of life because it is in the soul analogous to the activity that is found in living creatures. It affords the same advantages and is subject to the same exigencies. Certainly this life in the human soul takes very various forms. In the life of the intelligence, the mind seeks for truth and produces thought. Moral life is also an interior activity, whereby the will makes efforts towards the good by means of desires and resolutions. But the soul is capable of receiving a further fresh activity, whereby both mind and heart together seek God, and are united to Him by faith and love. This is piety. There is no doubt but that piety is a true interior activity, since it sets in motion all the faculties of the soul, and since it overflows externally in the fruits that are the product of its fecundity. First of all, the mind is brought into play, being enlightened by the splendors of faith. Having been awakened with regard to God, it fixes its attention upon Him and advances daily in the knowledge of His infinite being, until its thought cannot be torn away from an object of never-ending self-revelation. This happy intimacy withdraws the mind from the disturbing appearances of mean and changing things, and sustains it in an atmosphere of pure truth with which God Himself surrounds it. And then immediately follows the heart, with its increased treasures of activity. Under the spell of truth and beauty, it is carried away by the impulse of love, and repeats the word of St. Augustine, "O beauty, ever ancient and ever fresh, too late have I known thee, too late have I loved thee." This thrill of the heart leads on to union with the God of our love, and then an ineffable intimacy between the Creator and His humble creature is set up in the depths of the soul. Whoever has felt the love of God knows by experience with what a lofty activity it enriches the heart. The will, in turn, receives an increase of activity from the fact that God fills the soul with His strength. It is conscious of possessing a power for action that nature alone could not impart. And under the influence of grace called forth in it by piety, it makes decisions more boldly, sets to work with a more vigorous hand, does not shrink from painful sacrifices, and is better equipped for the fulfillment of duty. Through piety, the soul is manifestly strengthened by the presence of a being higher than itself. This interior activity, which is the fruit of the life of piety, cannot be confined within. It reveals itself outwardly as inevitably as the rising sap in spring is revealed in the buds of plants. Later on we shall note what fruits are to be gathered on the tree of piety. But everyone knows that owing to the action of this interior life, behavior is leavened with modesty and self-control, the character becomes more gentle and even, speech is permeated with supernatural charity, the hands engage in works of zeal and devotion, and the whole man abandons himself to the inspiration of grace, to immolate selfishness and to make a disinterested gift of self. For the true sap of the life of piety produces only such fruits as these. But this life, which is of such high value, is as unstable and fragile as the most delicate of living things. It would be an act of unpardonable carelessness not to watch over it. And it is capable of increase. In saints who abandon themselves to its sway, it rises daily even higher and higher. Whether it be St. Francis of Sales, or St. Vincent de Paul, St. Teresa, or St. John of the Cross, whether they live unknown under the shadow of a monastery or lost amidst the crowd of a busy world, they attain to striking or humble sanctity by means of the cultivation of this life of piety. Their faith gains vitality, and they go to the invisible God with as much certainty as if they saw Him with their eyes. Their love, too, becomes more ardent, and in the ecstasy of possessing their God, their tenderness of feeling participates in their joy, their breast expands, and their heart swells and beats more strongly. The will, too, as if healed of every weakness, endures suffering with cheerfulness and undertakes work with zeal, and perseveres in the most austere of sacrifices. And this progress in the life of piety is only realized by the diligence used by the saints in sustaining their souls by the exercises of religion. In order to lose nothing of the divine gift, they watch the gate of their own heart with jealous care. By means of the practice of conscientious recollection, which cannot be observed without a constant mortification of the senses, they take good care not to let their mind and imagination wander abroad, and thus they put a stop to vain thoughts and disturbing fancies, which only create disorder in the inner man. And at the same time they have a holy hunger for spiritual nourishment. They love pious reading, and gather from it the bread of faith. Then they assimilate this spiritual food by means of meditation, and since the very exercise of an activity develops life, they arouse themselves by the inner motions of prayer, by aspirations towards God, and by incessant protestations of love and fidelity. But on the other hand, how many souls, alas, afford the sad spectacle of a progressive falling off? In the world there are many who pass from a life of fervor to an almost death-like coldness, and no one is surprised at it. Nor are they few in the priestly and religious state, nor even perchance in the cloister, and this is more to be wondered at. Wherever it is found, this falling off of life always passes through the same phases and follows from the same causes. The beginning was full of fervor and facility. As long as there was a relish for the things of God, as long as piety required no effort, it was easy to be lulled by it. But soon sensible enjoyment disappeared, and the first enthusiasm wore off. To advance necessitated continual effort, and the toil became wearisome. Spiritual idleness began within. The external exercises went on, though the inner life was sinking, and by dint of growing slack, and despite of fugitive acts, it ended by losing all activity, even if it did not die out altogether. Then comes the stage of suppressing the external exercises, because they have become to be a burden. Yet these might have restored life once more, and if, for instance, in a monastery they are still kept up from necessity, they remain without effect, because the soul no longer is alive enough to assimilate the nourishment that they furnish. It is strange that as the love of life is so deeply rooted in man's heart, he is so careless about preserving and promoting it. Certainly he loves his physical life, and nevertheless the fear of death leaves him careless in the face of perils that a prudent hygiene would keep at a distance. So too the Christian surely values his religious life, but he is not less light and lax in his way of meeting the dangers that a little energy would circumvent. If the love of life has so little hold upon our wills, it is because we are doubtless too ignorant of its value and advantage. Let us attempt to gain a more enlightened knowledge of it. Chapter 4. Piety is the life of God in man. If there be any reason that can add to our appreciation of the life of piety, it is having the assurance that piety is the life of God within us. This interior activity, which is an aspect of the inner impulse of piety, may be considered as divine from different points of view. First, because it seeks God. Next, because it finds Him and becomes possessed of Him. And lastly, because it makes us participate in the very life of God. All religious endeavor, and particularly that of piety, sets man in motion towards God. The man of piety is a pilgrim on the way to find God. He calls upon God with all the desires of his soul, and by the impatient curiosity of his mind, as well as by the ardent aspirations of his heart. In this quest he asks for God of every creature, of everything that lives on the face of the earth, of every immensity, like that of the ocean or of the heavens, of all that shines with bright and mysterious light, like the stars in the sky or genius amongst men. And in proportion as created things reply to him, "We are not thy God," his uneasiness increases, and he says with St. Augustine, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O God, and our heart cannot rest until it is stayed on thee." To express his anxiety, he might readily use the word of Canticles, "In my bed by night I sought him whom my soul loveth. I sought him and found him not. I will rise and will go about the city. In the streets and the broad ways I will seek him whom my soul loveth. I sought him and I found him not. The watchmen who keep the city found me. Have you seen him whom my soul loveth? When I had a little passed by them, I found him whom my soul loveth. I held him, and I will not let him go till I bring him into my mother's house." Canticles chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. These passionate words give a vivid picture of the emotion felt by every man who is torn with religious yearning. But they are still truer as an expression of the panting desire called forth in the soul by the life of piety. Is not God already our life when we feel such ardor, when He too becomes the object of a quest so engrossing and so eager? Moreover, God does not conceal Himself from those who seek Him. He answers the pious Christian in the words that Pascal so often heard in the depths of his heart: "Be of good comfort, thou wouldst not seek me, if thou hadst not found me." To every man who seeks God Himself with all sincerity of spirit, Jesus says, "Ask, and it shall be given you; seek, and you shall find; knock, and it shall be opened to you." Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. This promise is infallible only, and then alone deserves to be so, when God is the object of our quest. After seeking for God throughout creation, it is at the bottom of his own heart that man finds him. This is not because God has not left traces of his power throughout the universe, not because he has not filled the world with his glory, but because nowhere is he known so clearly, nowhere is he felt so deeply, as at the bottom of the human heart. The kingdom of God is within you, said Jesus. Luke chapter 17, verse 21. For this is where the meeting in piety between man and God takes place. There it is that man hears these sweet and strong words, "Yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore have I drawn thee, taking pity on thee." Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 3. I am a closer friend to thee than this one or that, for I have done for thee more than they, and they would not endure for thee what I have suffered for thy sake. I love thee more fervently than thou hast loved thy defilements. There too it is that the Christian says to his God in the words of the Magdalene, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. John chapter 20, verse 16. Or of the disciple brought back to the faith, My Lord and my God. John chapter 20, verse 28. Then it is that the soul enters into the possession of God. The august presence animates the pious soul, and feelings of the greatest ardor and generosity arise therein. God himself is the cause of this revival of activity, for through him life makes a fresh start, so that it is again true to say that God, gained possession of through piety, adds an increase of life. But he does far more, for piety not only takes hold of him as of a treasure that one clasps in one's hand, nor like a guest whose comforting words one listens to, but it also incorporates him within. It gets impregnated with him, and he becomes its life. St. Paul, in his speech at Athens, tells us that God is all about us, like the air. In him we live and move and be. Acts chapter 17, verse 28. St. Peter goes further still when he says that we are made partakers of the divine nature. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. We are surely still men, but a divine influence penetrates us through and through. The life of God is united with ours to uplift and transfigure us. This is an impenetrable mystery that faith cannot but adore, and which reason can only admire without making any impression upon it. This is why theology teaches us that God communicates his life to us in two ways, by nature and by grace. By nature our life is only a pale likeness of his own. By grace, on the contrary, it is his very life that is given to us. It is indeed but a feeble ray emitted from its divine source, since the narrow prism of our soul can receive no more. But it is, in fine, a true ray coming from him, and is rich with his own light and fruitfulness. And we will not only say of this life that it is the delicious fruit of piety, but it is piety itself, and constitutes its living activity. And what, in fact, are the acts of piety? It is by means of it, as we have said, that the soul seeks God, takes possession of God, and lives on God. But for a soul to perform such acts, God must already have taken up his abode within us by grace. It is he who is present in the soul, even before she is conscious of the fact. It is he who awakens her and fills her with uneasiness, and who urges her on to seek her Saviour with eagerness and perseverance. And so the first grace that God gives us is to stir up in us the desire to find Him. The second is that in mercy and goodness He comes to us and gives Himself to us. And the effort by means of which we gain possession of Him, as well as the love for Him that springs up in our hearts, is no less the work of His grace than of our liberty. He ends by becoming our interior activity, because His grace communicates to us that fertility of feeling and of work that are the crown of piety. But if piety is the very life of God within us, let us beware of thinking that man has no part in it, for the important thing is to receive it, or to increase and preserve it. God only offers it for our free acceptance. He only puts it near us. Our free will alone can implant it within us. If we do not love it, if we do not take it, it is not ours, and remains outside us. Hence the life of piety is only ours at the same time as it is God's. Indeed, it could not be otherwise, and God could not give us the life of piety in spite of ourselves. By this ineffable gift He means to make us greater, and He does this to the point of making us divine. But in exalting us in this way by means of the supernatural, it was important that He should not diminish us in our nature, and this is why, having regard for our liberty, He makes His gifts dependent upon our will. And if God treats us thus, if He only gives us His life to preserve the dignity of ours and to uplift it afterwards to the height of His own, we must go towards Him with an eagerness born of thankfulness and love. Chapter 5. Piety is the life of Jesus Christ in the Christian. To say that piety implants in us the life of God is to say that it gives us the life of Jesus Christ. For since it has pleased God to reveal Himself to the world in His Son, Jesus Christ, it is by the Saviour that He communicates with us and lives in us. He is no longer the abstract and distant omnipotent one, only figured by gross symbols in the imagination of the people. In the person of Jesus Christ He vouchsafes to make Himself seen and heard and touched, and He further vouchsafes to make His presence perceptible in our midst under the Eucharistic species until the end of time. If then it be in Jesus Christ that the Christian possesses his God, Jesus Himself will be the first principle of his life of piety. Jesus Himself will call forth the feelings of love and acts of prayer that bring God within us, and it is from Jesus that we shall get the fruitful activity which is piety. That He is the soul of our piety, He Himself tells us in the Gospel. Where there are 2 or 3 gathered together in My name, there am I in the midst of them. Matthew chapter 18, verse 20. When Jesus says to His disciples, I am the way, and the truth, and the life, no man cometh to the Father but by Me, John chapter 14, verse 6, He evidently puts Himself forward as the religious mediator who is necessary for us to go to God by means of piety. And He reveals to us a still closer intimacy. Abide in Me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abide in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in Me. If any one abide not in Me, he shall be cast forth as a branch, and shall wither, and they shall gather him up and cast him into the fire, and he burneth. If you abide in Me, and My words abide in you, you shall ask whatever you will, and it shall be done unto you. John chapter 15, verses 4 and 7. Thus our prayer will bring forth fruit like the living branch of the vine, on condition that the very sap of Jesus be in us to make us fruitful. He declared the condition on which the Christian abides in Jesus and Jesus in him, after the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood abideth in me, and I in him. John chapter 6, verse 57. Thus, according to the Gospel, Jesus, living in the Christian, is the principle of his religious life, and the Eucharist is the bread which sustains that life. St. Paul takes up this doctrine and makes it the subject of his teaching. Christ dwells by faith in our hearts, he says, and he hath shined in our hearts. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16, and 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. I live, now not I, but Christ liveth in me. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. For to me to live is Christ. Philippians chapter 1, verse 21. For the great apostle of Christ, Jesus lives in us to shape our prayers, and he gives us his Spirit to be the soul of our religion. The Spirit, says St. Paul, helpeth our infirmity, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself asketh for us with unspeakable groanings. And he that searcheth the hearts knoweth what the Spirit desireth, because he asketh for the saints according to God. Romans chapter 8, verses 26 and 27. In order that we may better understand that this Spirit that thus prays within us is indeed that of Jesus Christ, he says elsewhere in his epistles, because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Galatians chapter 4, verse 6. Thus, Jesus is not only our life, and therefore the principle of all our interior religious activity, but he is strictly our prayer, and he produces its aspirations and its expression within us. Our life of piety belongs to him even more than it does to us. It is sufficiently our own for us to get the merit of it, but it so far belongs to him that we are bound to give him all the glory of it. And now, in order to throw light upon this mystery of Jesus living in the Christian by means of piety, we will borrow a comparison from St. Paul to explain at once both the nature of our relations with Christ and the wonderful union amongst all the faithful wrought by Christ. All those who have been baptized, he says, together make up the body of Christ. Christians are the members, and Christ himself is the head of it. Just as in a living organism order demands that all the members shall be subject to the head, and that all the members shall work in harmony to serve the head, so in the Church Christ alone orders, and all the members obey. Christ alone makes the plans that the members carry out. Obedient to the suggestions of the same Christ, Christians are not jealous of one another, but each fulfills the part, however humble it may be, that is assigned to him. But Christ is more than the head in the society of the faithful. He distributes life, along with the blood, to all the parts. His Spirit inspires life and movement everywhere. Every good thought, every noble feeling, and every virtuous action proceeds from its inspiration or his grace. Is there anything greater for a Christian than to live thus by the Spirit of Jesus? Is any closer union amongst all the faithful conceivable than the mutual dependence in which they live as members of one body or as branches of one tree? And what happy consequences follow from this beautiful doctrine? Jesus, then, is the living religion both of each believer and of the whole Church. The duties which during his mortal life he began to carry out for his Father these he still fulfills throughout the ages and all over the world, in the heart of each Christian and in the whole assembly of the elect. If you are bowed in adoration before God, it is He who adores His Father. If your heart is aflame with the love of God, He is Himself the burning source from which the flame proceeds. If the feeling of your own wretchedness fills you with desires and supplications, He is Himself the voice that gives them expression before God. If in an outburst of generosity you eagerly undertake to observe hard rules of personal sacrifice by mortifications or missionary work, it is His zeal that seeks to be accomplished in you. Would you not lend yourself to all His plans in regard to yourself? After having been received as a member of His sacred body, would you rebel against the head that directs you? Or what shall I say, against the heart that gives you life? What? Would Jesus meet with your resistance? In you, will He not be able to take His fill of love and respect for His Father? To give yourself up to piety is then to give yourself up to Jesus, adoring, praying, loving, acting, and sacrificing Himself, all this in you. But the word that through your piety He speaks within you reverberates in the hearts of all believers who live on Him. Thanks then to His action in you, your prayer has, as it were, a divine echo, and its sound goes forth through all the Church. And with a wonderful reaction, the prayers inspired by Jesus in all other Christians are repeated in your own heart, so that it is the mighty voice of the whole Church that re-echoes in you. Such is the law of the living body. The activity of the humblest part is felt through the whole organism. But in return for this, the work of the whole organism benefits the humblest of the parts. If piety procures for the soul of the Christian this beneficent communion of the saints, if it evokes the ineffable joy of feeling that the least of prayers has its value for the whole Church, and that all the prayers of the Church have their value for the least of souls, this is because piety, instead of being a motion limited to one poor human heart, is the very life of Jesus Christ in a state of activity within each believer. Chapter 6. Piety is an interior life. Of all forms of life, piety is the one that manifests its activity in the most inward manner. It is interior not only in principle, but also in its effects, since, as we shall show farther on, it has for its end the transfiguration of the very faculties of the soul. Whether we consider the forces which in piety are set in motion towards God, or the place where God and man meet, piety seems to us to be an altogether interior life. Where then does piety dwell? We know well that it is not in the bended knee, nor in the clasped hands, nor in the extended arms, nor in the upturned eyes, nor in the bowed head, nor in the loud protestations of the lips. Although these exterior signs may be valuable aids to piety, sometimes to express it, and sometimes to stir it up, it is the soul itself that it arouses and sets in motion. Its peculiar activity begins and puts the crown on its work in the inmost recesses of the soul. The mind gathers together all its powers of attention and fixes upon God the twofold gaze of knowledge and faith, so as to be enlightened with His light and fascinated by His glories. Imagination comes to its assistance, and in order to sustain it, contributes a store of symbolic figures taken from all that is most majestic and beautiful in nature. The heart, once gained, is carried away with love and repentance and prayer, and with all the feelings that the memory of the past or the apprehension of the future can arouse. And these states of the heart, in the form of thankfulness or regret, an entire cleaving of the whole being to God, supplication and self-surrender, constitute the marrow of piety. Finally, the will obtains from this intimate intercourse the energy that gives it decision and fire, just as we see through the action of heat powerful engines accumulate stores of energy in readiness for work, so in proportion as piety enkindles the heart with charity, the will becomes enriched with a capacity for action which is manifested in Christian virtues. If such are the acts that characterize piety, is it not right to say that it is an interior life? It is none the less this, if we consider the place where it finds its object, which is God. The God whom you seek, O Christian, when you are carried away with the impulse of piety, is not for you at the end of the long pilgrimages you undertake, nor in the word of the famous preacher whom you go to hear, nor in the sound of the organ or the choir that touches you, nor even in the books that speak of Him to you with the deepest fervour. All these external influences help you to find Him, only because they bid you go hither where you are least often to be found, there where He is ever waiting for you, in the depths of your own heart. The kingdom of God is within you, says Jesus. Hence it is there that the meeting between your soul and God must take place. It is in this sanctuary that the ineffable union is consummated, which is the crown of piety. Being an interior activity, piety is found to be present in proportion to the intensity of this activity. You have an interior life of union with God, hence your piety is real, and it is capable of having various degrees, but there it is. On the contrary, if this interior life is wanting in you, in the holiest exercises you experience no feeling. Then you are not pious. Your manner of life may give you the outward appearances of piety, but you get no results from it. Nevertheless, beware of thinking that piety requires an uninterrupted strain of mind and heart. However supernatural it may be, it is also human, and consequently within the range of men's capacities. It is not inconsistent with inevitable distraction of mind, with being engrossed in study and in business entanglements, with the dryness and distaste engendered by custom. Simple souls, with only a glimmer of interior activity, do not lose it on that account. It would certainly be the perfection of piety if the soul could constantly have its attention fixed upon God and leap towards Him with an impetuous bound. Towards this ideal, inaccessible as it is to our earthly weakness, each of us should strive according to the grace that has been given him. Do not be astonished at distractions that appear to interrupt your pious activity. They are the inevitable consequence of our native infirmity, and do not be the least grieved at them, at any rate when they are involuntary. For just as birds in flight are not constantly beating their wings, but let themselves be borne onwards smoothly by the swift impetus they have gained by vigorous exertion, so souls have alternations of interior effort and repose, and in these periods of repose they still gain ground and virtue from the impulse they have received. When our attention fails from mere weakness, life still goes on unhindered. Nevertheless, it is your duty to prevent, if possible, and to fight against distractions, lest they should invade the soul and at last develop into spiritual idleness. This invasion is most to be dreaded by those who are given to study or taken up with business. For them there is a great danger lest a life estranged from piety should be set up in their souls, and fill the whole field, and absorb all their activities. This is why in so many study is harmful to piety, usually not on account of the dangerous notions it instills into their minds, but owing to the place which it increasingly occupies to the detriment of piety which it ousts. All who are overburdened with work or business are subject to the same failure of piety. Two means must then be used to keep the religious life in its integrity. The first is to make our studies a subject of prayer, and to do the same with our work or our business, in our intercourse with God. For in this way our piety will continue to be active in our whole being, and will sanctify all the aims that engross our interest. The second consists in renewing the thought of God in our soul from time to time, and in offering the activity that we are about to display in the duties of our calling as a sacrifice and prayer to God. For to work is to pray. If we should happen to be tried with dryness, coldness, and distaste, and if intimate intercourse with God becomes a wearisome burden to us, we should neither be alarmed nor discouraged, nor should we relax our exterior exercises. Let us not wonder if our interior activity suffers a certain amount of wear and tear. This ill, which is an entirely material one, will be remedied with a period of rest. Also, by dint of constant repetition of the same thoughts and feelings, it is possible that the power of being moved by them may be lost. Then it will be enough to make a frequent change in our reading or our practices to revive life within us. Distaste is no danger from the suffering it entails, but only from the carelessness that it induces. And then it is important that without bitterness, and with the heart left calmly in the hands of God, we should remain as faithful in our relations with Him as during the period of consolations. The interior life is not dead, but it shows no flame because it is sleeping, like the fire beneath the ashes. Among the simple, piety sometimes appears to be wanting, since they are scarcely aware of the outlines of the interior life. But make no mistake, for there are naive and uncultured souls in whom piety attains the very highest degree. They have not the complexity of thought and feeling of those who are better educated, but their very ignorance of the things of earth enables them to fix their gaze in all its intensity on God and on the mysteries of Christ. They bring to bear upon them a mind and heart less divided, and they are less unstable, less disturbed, more filled with consolation, and more faithful. It was indeed a simple soul, but one nevertheless of great interior activity, who was one day questioned by the Curé d'Ars about the many hours he spent in the church before God, and who answered, speaking of the Master present in the tabernacle, "I tell him, and he tells me." Chapter 7. Piety has its source in faith. The Apostle St. Paul rightly says that the just man liveth by faith. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. For the life of the Christian is nourished and expressed by piety. And it is clear that piety springs from faith as its natural source. Everything in piety presupposes faith. He who prays abides in the presence of God and converses with God. He gives ear to His words, reveals to Him his heart's desires, and enters into engagements with Him. But God does not make Himself perceptible to the eyes of man. Faith alone can call Him forth and realize His presence as an indisputable fact. Without a living faith, we can have neither prayer on our lips nor love in our hearts. The Eucharist is the center of our piety. All our interior attention is concentrated on the altar, and it is at the holy table that we renew our moral energies. But to our eyes, the Eucharist is no more than a little piece of bread. It is only by faith that we can discover its ineffable riches, because faith acknowledges that Jesus Christ Himself is present in it. And thus it is with all the sacraments, and especially with the sacrament of penance. This holy tribunal would only present to us a man in the priest who gives absolution, and merely a human consolation in the exhortations that he addresses to us, unless faith assured us that Jesus Christ lived in His priest, and that God Himself loosed the conscience by the words of absolution, and that in it the redeeming blood of Calvary purified and healed the wounds of the soul. Therefore, the life of piety cannot breathe except in the divine atmosphere of faith. If faith disappears, piety immediately dies, because it no longer has an environment in which it can exist. If faith languishes or diminishes in purity, piety suffers a like decadence, and withers like a plant deprived of air and light. But if faith increases in intensity, piety revives, and blossoms, and bears fruit, like corn that grows up and turns yellow during the first summer heat. And if piety so far depends upon faith, whoever earnestly wishes to be pious must be earnest in keeping and strengthening his faith. Amongst all our favorite prayers, we should often repeat that of the Apostles, "Lord, increase our faith," Luke chapter 17, verse 5. Or that of the humble centurion, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief," Mark chapter 9, verse 23. Certainly, faith is a favor of God. It is He who gives and preserves it. Nevertheless, man has his part in it. He obtains it by good will, and keeps it by prudence. As soon as he draws it to him by his good desires, it is on the threshold of his soul, and if he keeps a jealous watch over it, he preserves it from all harm. And in this way, without ceasing to be God's gift, faith becomes a trophy of man's. Faith as the source of Christian life must then be the object of constant solicitude on our part. But what zeal should we have for it if we knew what it is and what its value is to us, the dangers that threaten it, and the means of preserving it? Regarded from within, faith is a motion of the soul towards God, an impulse of our whole being towards our Creator, an inspiration towards the light that emanates from this divine source, towards the moral strength of which He is the center, and towards the happiness whose treasures are contained in Him. Thus understood, faith is an endeavor towards the Omnipotent, both to present to Him the homage of a creature that is dependent upon Him, and also to tell Him of the needs of a being who feels his own weakness. If this need for God were to be extinguished in us, if this inward call were to be silenced, then faith would be lost. But the human soul, under the impulse of faith, does not cast itself into the void. The very fear of the void would be enough to stifle all religious feeling in the soul. The soul only strives towards a definite object, which it holds to be really existing, and which it would embrace. This object is contained in the creed that it confesses. There could then be no question of faith unless there were a creed containing the articles of faith. And as the limitations of man are too great for him to create a creed for himself, he receives it from the religious society, the Church, which has God's authority to teach. If he wishes for a real faith, and no mere vague feeling of elevation towards the ideal, he cannot but accept the creed proposed to him by the Church, and he must accept it in its integrity, and not refine it away with perilous subtleties. He must accept it in the same sense as the Church prescribes it to him, for fear of nullifying it by emptying it of its meaning. So then, to possess the faith from which life proceeds is to have at heart that activity which uplifts man towards God and makes him adhere faithfully to the religious dogmas of the creed. If the heart were to be paralyzed, or the creed to fade away, in either case faith would be ruined. But who would not dread such ruin? Could anything more harmful happen to man? If faith has the promise of the life that now is, as well as the promise of the life eternal, does not the loss of the faith mean the loss of everything? Without the faith, the present life is to us no more than a dark prison, and an enclosed field in which we engage in struggles that have no meaning. To him who has no outlook on eternity, and on a hereafter in which life may find its fulfillment and reward, the present life is an inexplicable enigma, an evil nightmare, and it is given over to the most brutal appetites and cannot be controlled by any moral law. As soon as faith is wanting, hope is wanting. But even if you have lost hope and are immured in the present, you have not succeeded in getting rid of eternity. It remains a possibility, since so many others believe in it. It remains a probability, since so many men of great genius have believed in it. And those who believe in it enter into no other undertaking than to live a better life in the present. You who do not believe in it lose all, since you run the risks of that eternity which perhaps exists, and since you spoil the present by ruining the vigor of resolution that the thought of eternity imparts to believers. Thus is eternal salvation attached to faith. The gates of eternal bliss will only open to those who have knocked at them here below. But even in this life, faith begins the happiness of the believer. It gives his mind peace as to questions of destiny that are a perpetual anguish to the human heart. With faith, a man can ignore accidental things, for at least he knows what is essential. He knows himself. He knows what he is, whence he comes, and whither he is going. This knowledge ennobles him in the sight of his own conscience, because it shows him how far he is above inferior beings. Thanks to faith, he has the courage to fight against his evil instincts, and he bears suffering with patience, for he knows that his struggles with his passions or with suffering will meet with an eternal recompense hereafter. Furthermore, in this hand-to-hand contest with evil and suffering, he feels that he is not alone, for the cry then uttered by his faith obtains for him, he does not doubt it, an endowment of strength from on high. And if such is the life imparted by his faith to the Christian, how can he help feeling alarmed as soon as he sees it threatened? From whatever quarter the peril may come, he fears it and prepares to take steps against it. He is not of those imprudent people who toy with danger. He is too fearful to become the victim of his own weakness. Since he is thoroughly persuaded that nothing better withstands morbid influences than a stoutly constituted temperament, he stirs up his faith by means of a religion that is fully alive. He knows the mutual reactions of piety and faith upon each other. He knows that if piety springs from faith, the breath of piety arouses and develops faith. He prays that he may believe better. In the same way, he fosters his faith by religious studies well planned. He knows that if he feeds his mind on thoughts which are foreign or hurtful to faith, he will end by enervating or poisoning it. And this is why he takes pleasure in Holy Scripture, and in the writings of religious authors, and in the science of theology. Since he cannot escape from a world the atmosphere of which is impregnated with unbelief, as he inhales poison in the conversations to which he listens, and in the papers and books that he reads, and in the social environment with which he is surrounded, at least he checks as much as possible these evil communications, and protects his faith with strict vigilance. In this way, he keeps intact the sources of his piety, and his faith, preserved in its purity, enables his interior life to grow in intensity and to be manifested outwardly in visible actions. Chapter 8. Piety is maintained by external exercises. Although life is an interior activity, it would perish if it remained concentrated within us. Its flame would soon be put out if it were shut in a closed vessel and deprived of air. Moreover, what is the sign by which you recognize that a creature is alive? If it moves and feeds, you say it lives. And further, acting and eating seem to be not only signs of life, but also necessary conditions for its preservation. Without motion and food, all life ceases. And it is the same with piety. External exercises are indispensable to its maintenance. On the ground that it is an interior activity, do not so far relegate it within that nothing of it appears outside. That would quickly bring it to naught. Be sure that external regularity in piety, however edifying it may be, has not for its object the attraction of the attention of others, so much as the awakening and nourishment in yourself of the religious life. And beware of the fatal delusion of making any reduction in your visible acts of religion. If you have at heart an ardent faith, you will not be able to bury it there. It is overflowing by nature, and it needs signs of outward expression. The more it is alive within, the more it will break forth outwardly. In your best impulses of piety, when the love of God fires your heart with most ardor, you have knelt down and stretched out your arms towards the crucifix. You have gone to prostrate yourself before the tabernacle. You have passed hours of meditation in the silent corner of a church, and you have perhaps uttered burning words. Every time an impetus of life has been felt in your soul, there has inevitably sprung from it, as out of some deep spring, manifestations that could not be repressed. Give then free course to such effusions of piety, for in thus overflowing, in addition to the joy with which it inundates you, it increases in intensity. The external acts of piety are very rightly called exercises. The good that is done to the life of the body by physical exercises, spiritual exercises effect in the same way for the life of the soul. All living powers are increased by action. You would then condemn your soul to progressive atrophy if you deprived it of the good of daily exercises. And on the contrary, you will develop and strengthen it if you stir up your faculties with the acts of religion. The more you pray, the more will you get a taste and aptitude for prayer. The more regular you are in pious reading, the more will you feel a holy activity in doing it. The more faithful you are in following the sacred offices of the Church, the more you will love them. To omit from distaste a certain part of the exercises of piety is to run the risk of soon doing without them altogether, and wisdom bids us rather to overcome the first attacks of interior weariness by still greater diligence. In the same way as in the depths of the winter, energetic motion imparts a glow to limbs frozen with cold, because it thoroughly stirs the vitality within, so, when desolated with spiritual cold, the violent fulfillment of the motions and exercises of piety awakens the life of the soul and restores its fervor. Therefore, during periods of languor, make use of the remedy recommended by experience and common sense. Moreover, these languors are usually brought about by a want of interior nourishment, for there are more souls than one would suppose who in the service of God let themselves die of hunger. Bread is within their reach, both the bread of supernatural grace and that of human help, but they do not make use of it. But the great good of pious exercises faithfully fulfilled is just this, that they feed the soul with the spiritual bread that is necessary to its life. In return for the sacrifices that you undertake in order to make room for your spiritual exercises amidst your occupations, and to pray in spite of your dryness, God recompenses you with an increase of grace. During the hours that you spend, even in aridity, beneath the eyes of the Father, His gifts fall upon you like a blessed rain that waters and makes you bear fruit. By the holy inspirations that He gives you, by the pious readings in which you spend your time, and by the spiritual instructions that you go to hear, He sheds upon you His light, and He stirs within you the glow of His love. All these are benefits of which you would have been deprived if you had omitted your exercises by neglect. Say not that all this is a loss of time, for during the hours you devote to Him, even if they yield no consolation, God sows in your soul seeds which contain in germ the harvests of the future. May these motives make you resolve on the faithful observance of the exercises which a wise director would prescribe to one in your position. It is not a good thing for such exercises to take up the whole of the day, nor even the greater part of your time, for you have duties of your state to fulfill, and you must remember that the duties of your state ought not to come between you and God. Even if you are sufficiently at leisure to give all your time to piety, you ought not to be advised to do it. It would indeed be a bad thing for your mind to be always on the strain. If it had not long intervals of rest, it would end by breaking down or becoming dulled. Moreover, the thought of God will follow you amidst your work, and even if it were to become unconscious and entirely virtual, its impulse will nevertheless be the force that will guide you. You will then take a reasonable time for your exercises of piety. What is it to be? You will fix it according to the leisure left you by the duties of your state. If you are a religious, whether living in community or not, you will first of all fulfill in their integrity the exercises prescribed for you in your rule, for it is to their strict observance that for you divine grace is attached. But since nothing better arouses our activity than the acts that we do spontaneously, you will add to the exercises of the rule some personal exercises, even if they only be a few minutes of prayer or of reading, so that their initiative may be in the eyes of God a testimony of your generosity. If you are living in the world, but with a firm resolve to live a life of piety in it, Your regulations will include some daily vocal prayers, such as the morning and evening prayer and the recitation of the Rosary, some mental prayers, such as meditative prayer and visits to the Blessed Sacrament, pious reading for at least a quarter of an hour in some ascetical work, and above all, the sacraments of penance and of the Holy Eucharist, Holy Mass and Holy Communion will be the essential acts of religion towards which all the other exercises should converge as a constant preparation. If you are one of those who are so numerous in our modern society, whose hours are wholly consumed with intercourse and business, your religious exercises will be certainly very curtailed. Nevertheless, you will set aside during the day a few scarcely noticeable moments, not less religiously observed than the times for meals, during which you will devote yourself to the business of your soul and to the worship of God. To you also the treasures of piety may be opened, but on the following conditions. Morning and evening you will pray upon your knees. Twice a day you will enter into your conscience for a few seconds, in the morning to arrange the order of your time, and in the evening to examine the use you have made of it. Not a single day will pass without your giving a few minutes to feed your heart and mind on some good religious reading. And lastly, amidst all your occupations, you will carry with you the thought of God and the desire to be kind to your fellow men. Such a limited scheme is within the reach of those who are most taken up with business. Happy are they if in addition thereto, and to attending Mass on Sundays and feast days, they are able also to hear Mass and say the Rosary daily. Note in conclusion that this regularity in pious exercises demands as much flexibility as delicacy. If it requires exactitude, still there must be no rigidity. Just as negligence would be harmful, so inflexibility would be out of place. A duty of one's state of life must always take precedence of an exercise of piety, and often a deed of charity will have to come first. For if we consider rightly, we only cultivate piety in order to be virtuous and good, and it would be to do an injury to piety if we were to put it before the end it has in view. Chapter 9. Piety requires mortification. As the stone falls towards the center of gravity, and as the compass points towards the magnetic pole, so the soul of man, as soon as it is free, takes its bearings towards God, and goes straight to Him by means of piety. It is indeed of importance to increase the power of the inward attraction that draws us towards God, but it is still more necessary to set our souls free from the ties that hinder our impulses and check our steps, for we are captives, and it is our moral chains that fetter our piety. Do we really altogether mean to be pious? Then we must work for our deliverance. The virtue which has the effect of liberating the soul is called mortification. There are 2 degrees of mortification. It is first of all a deliverance, and afterwards it may become a holocaust. Its first object is to establish within us the rule of God over our passions that have been subdued, and so far as this, all are bound to it, if they make any pretense of living as virtuous Christians. When it has once subdued a man to God, it is able to sacrifice to His glory the flesh that has been already brought under control, and the soul that is subjected to obedience. But this immolation of the Carmelite or the Carthusian remains optional. For instance, however excellent the maceration of the body may be, It is not obligatory. It is of mortification as a means of deliverance that Jesus says, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me." Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. And again, "What doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world, and suffer the loss of his own soul?" Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. And St. Paul gives a very definite commentary on these words when he says, "If you live according to the flesh, you shall die. But if by the Spirit you mortify the deeds of the flesh, you shall live." Romans chapter 8, verse 13. Mortification, then, kills the germs of death, and therefore it gives the seeds of life favorable conditions for development. The life of piety, which is both the principle and the fruit of the divine activity within us, could not therefore subsist and grow without mortification. Since it is admitted that piety is a free and ready impulse of love towards God, a soul will only be really pious if it has broken with all external hindrances and removed those that are within. It is the work of mortification to accomplish this twofold deliverance. What piety can you expect to find in a soul that is dissipated and engrossed in things external? God is not to be met with in the squares of the town. He only gives Himself to those who look for Him in their own hearts. How then, perchance, has it happened to you to go out of yourself through curiosity? Your eyes, being open to all the sights around you, wanted to see everything, to feast to the full on every novelty, and to stop in front of every picture. Your ears, eager to hear everything, listened to every tale, incited people to backbiting, if not to calumny, and became the receptacle of every rumor in the world around you. Your steps were bent in the direction of ribald and frivolous company, and wherever it was impossible to reflect upon oneself. And at the same time, in your vanity you tried to attract the attention of others, and for this end you displayed in your outward appearance and in your words all that could give you some personal merit, and hence you were not at all anxious about having some real worth within, provided that you were able by some tawdry outward glitter to catch the eye. Lastly, your sensuous feeling was easily captured in the snare of vulgar pleasure and worldly attachments. You took to the world in order to get more enjoyments, and your heart became entangled in a net, the meshes of which it could not break through. And do you think that a soul so far an absentee from itself, so fast a prisoner in a foreign land, can go to meet its God and run towards Him? No, for certainty, in such a state, piety is impossible. If, however, you have good desires, begin by entering within yourself. Gather together your scattered powers, your mind, your heart, your imagination, and your senses. Break the bonds that keep you a captive. I do not say the bonds of your business affairs and of your just connections, but the chains that weigh so heavily on your hands and feet. This breaking away, this brave recapture of yourself, will be your first act of mortification, and the second will be the vigilance you show in not letting yourself go again. Your eyes will be veiled with a modesty and caution that will not allow them to be the open doors by which your soul was wont to run far away from you. Your ears, too, will be discreet, chaste, and closed to news from without. You will no longer make a foolish display of yourself in your clothes and speech, and you will be more anxious to be than to appear. You will make a sacrifice of things that gratify the senses, and you will ever have a hand upon your heart ready to protect it from robbers. It is upon these conditions that you will be at home with yourself. By mortification, piety will become possible to you. Nevertheless, you have not yet accomplished the conquest of yourself. For when you have been set free from things external, you will still have to escape slavery within. Alas, man is not always at liberty, even in his own house. Indeed, I believe that the reason that so many people like to wander away from their own hearts is because the heart itself is a harder tyrant to them than all the external masters whose yoke they bear. This is why interior mortification is so important. But its object is so subtle that it is hard to grasp, and so difficult that it requires the exertion of more strength to gain it. Have you not felt that your flesh is a capricious slave? Sometimes it is heavy and idle, sometimes, on the contrary, weak and incapable of effort. When well fed, it rebels. When too starved, it becomes refractory. When its ill-regulated appetites are awakened, what humiliations, what dangers, what anguish of conscience, what obsessions of the imagination! Its coarse appeals are sometimes so noisy that the pure voices of sanctity are as it were stifled by them. And add to this the vile suggestions of over-susceptibility and jealousy. Over-susceptibility, that inner outbreak of wounded pride, which makes us believe that people have been wanting in regard for us, and that they have trespassed upon what is due to us, and that they cherish perverse purposes against us. Jealousy, that secret poison of the heart, made of the vexation we feel at the merit or success of others. And yet, I say nothing about the selfish ambition that only regards the world with reference to itself, which is aggravated by the happiness of others, as if it were a personal calamity, which will be responsible for nothing to anybody, which demands everything for itself: pleasure, honor, wealth, and power. Such is a rapid survey of the enemies that contend for our soul. The saints have felt no less than you the interior conflicts between the manifold passions of humanity. St. Paul complains of them even with bitterness. "Who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" he asks. Romans chapter 7, verse 24. "My grace is sufficient for thee," was the answer. Romans chapter 7, verse 25, and 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. As if the Spirit of God had said to him, "Thou shalt not destroy it, but by my grace thou shalt bring it under thy rule." And we well know that it was by mortification that the great apostle won the mastery over himself and established order and peace in his own heart. For he makes this confession: "I chastise my body and bring it into subjection." 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27. And you too will rule yourselves by mortification. You will treat your flesh as a slave who is not to be flattered or maltreated. You will keep it in a proper equilibrium. If it is subject to evil inclinations, you will administer correction until it has learned to obey. But you will carefully avoid reading, sights, reveries, and conversations which might arouse it with terrible awakenings. In proportion as you bridle the flesh, the interior passions will grow weaker. You will, however, keep watch over your heart in order to stifle them in their beginnings. Jealousy will get no hold upon you if you are large-hearted enough to thank God for the welfare of your brothers. Sensitiveness will not lead you to fire up in anger if kind-heartedness enables you to take the doings of others in good part. And lastly, selfishness will be trampled underfoot if you can forget yourself and not expect anything from anybody, and if you cultivate in yourself the desire to be of service. This interior mortification, which brings forth the moral life or the life of holiness, is only acquired by degrees, and as it grows, it enables the soul to start on its upward flight. A little of such mortification makes piety already easier, and when piety has gained more activity, it imparts more energy for mortification, and thus, by the mutual reaction of favorable influences, mortification and piety combined help the Christian to advance in the love and possession of God.